Good evening. My name is Bill Michael, and I am the Executive Director of the Reva and David Logan Center. And along with my colleagues, Jared Reesberg from the Institute of Politics and Elizabeth Davenport from Rockefeller Chapel, we are so pleased to welcome you here tonight. If this is your first time at the Logan Center, I certainly hope it is not your last. And if you are back, welcome back. This event is particularly special because it really represents a lot of what the Logan Center makes possible. We're thrilled to be in the midst of a three-week residency with a set of wonderful artists who are both working with our students and faculty while they develop some incredible art that, like much art, is really being created to comment on society today. And we're thrilled to be partnering with Rockefeller Chapel and IOP to have this conversation tonight, to really focus on the intersection of arts and politics and the power that the arts really have to change the societies around us and the important role that they play in the life of the entire university, our neighbors in the community, and the entire city. And so it's so great to have you here. We are thrilled with this residency to be partnering with our colleagues at the Harris Theater. Over the last 2 weeks, Anna and Joshua Roman and the many artists they're with have been developing a new piece called On Grace and engaging in master classes with our students and conversations like this as they create really important artwork that we are confident, like the conversation tonight, will continue to contribute to the kind of changes that I'm sure all of us in the audience hope to see in our communities and the world around us. It is now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Davenport, Dean of Rockefeller Chapel.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a great honor for us at Rockefeller to work with the Logan Center and the Institute of Politics and UChicago Arts to literally make tonight happen. Rockefeller has become a major venue for the arts over the past few years, and we're deeply committed to creating connections between spirituality and the arts, or the other way around, between arts and spirituality, and grace and what it means to be human are signature themes for us. So what more perfect than tonight, these themes mingled with politics, which adds the perfect match. And I am honored to introduce my colleague Darren Reesberg, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, to speak a little further to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and Elizabeth, and thanks to all of you for coming and joining us here tonight. As Elizabeth said, my name is Darren Reesberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and our mission at the Institute is to ignite in our students here a passion for politics and public service. We do want to thank UChicago Arts, the Logan Center, Rockefeller for being such wonderful partners on this event. And now it's my pleasure to give you some background on our panelists. First, Anna Deavere Smith. Anna is a professor, an actress, a playwright who is known for, among other things, her one-woman performances that meld theater, journalism, and social commentary. She has had powerful roles in such television shows as The West Wing and Nurse Jackie, and in such movies as The American President and Rachel Getting Married. And these talents and her many performances have garnered her myriad awards, including most recently the National Humanities Medal and the Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize. Anna, as Bill said, is in the midst of development of On Grace, a stage performance on which she's collaborating with cellist Joshua Roman. And we are so grateful that Anna and Joshua have chosen to spend 3 weeks in residency here at the University of Chicago's Logan Center for the Arts to further develop the On Grace project. We also have with us Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle, who was elected to that position. President Preckwinkle was elected to that position on November 2nd, 2010. From 1999 to 2010, President Preckwinkle served as the alderwoman for Chicago's 4th Ward, part of which is here in Hyde Park, for 19 years, where among many other critical initiatives, she sponsored ordinances relating to the living wage and affordable housing, limitations on payday loans, and the smoking ban. Prior to serving as alderman, President Preckwinkle served for 10 years as a teacher in Chicago public schools. And notably, President Preckwinkle holds both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the University of Chicago. So I'm going to clap there. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by the Institute's director, David Axelrod, who I dare to say, and only partly because he's my boss, is grace personified. So I will just ask you to join me now in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Thank you, Darren. You're going to go far in this organization. Well, it's great to be here with these two notable leaders in their fields. I must say that the notion of politics and grace may seem like an oxymoron to some people. And I had to tell you, when I was driving over here, I was just looking at my Twitter, because I mentioned that I was going to be doing this, and some guy responded, I assume it's a guy, it may not be, sounds like a guy, said, do you know what grace is, sir? And I thought, and I said, you know, I'm not sure I do. So I'm glad that you're here, Anna, because I want to ask you about that and educate myself. He finished by saying, grace and politics do not mix ever, Tony, ever. So I hope we can disabuse people of that notion while we're here as well. But and I did actually, I don't know that I have it with me, but I looked up grace in the dictionary, and there are lots of different interpretations of what grace is. And I did notice that one of them was clemency, so I think some of our politicians in town probably feel like they want some grace. So I'm not pointing at you, but you know some of them. But Anna, tell us, you're on a project now, and we so appreciate you being here and sharing our Chicago winter with us. Tell us about your project and begin to educate us on what you found in your explorations.
Well, I should say first of all that the development of On Grace, or its derivation, has something to do with something you've played a huge part of in this country, which is the Affordable Care Act. And I was interested in general about health care after having been invited to the Yale School of Medicine around 1996. The then head of internal medicine had really seen what was coming down the pike in American health care and invited me to come there and to create a performance for Medical Grand Rounds. And I just really was so struck by the types of narratives that patients had in particular, and just knew that this had to be my next play. And it took me, a lot of other things happened, and it took me until around 2005 to start the research. And I was looking more generally at the resilience of the human body and its vulnerability. So I did a wide-ranging whole period of research. I went to Africa 10 years after the genocide in Rwanda. I went to South Africa where, the president was being called an AIDS denialist, and I visited Germany, Ramstein Air Force Base and Landstuhl Hospital, where our soldiers are sort of taken to be patched back together after Iraq and so forth, just enough to get home. And so I had this very broad project, and it had two versions before it started heading to New York. And in one of them, my friend Mike Nichols, who I trust is a great director, came and said, this play is really about kindness. And somehow I switched that in my head that it was about grace, and went on this sort of journey to ask people, what is grace? But that was then interrupted by the fact that President Obama was going to roll out his plan for healthcare. And I was going to be in New York at the time that it was going to first really be a big part of national debate, and decided that the play should then be about the human side of healthcare, so that I could be a part of a bigger conversation, which is sort of my goal in writing plays or being an artist. That said, that play went on, and it did fine. It played in New York for a very, very healthy run, and then had a tour and was just on PBS and so forth. But I think of On Grace, because I still had all this wonderful material on that topic. I think of On Grace, this project that I'm working on here, as the unfinished business of Let Me Down Easy, which was about healthcare. Because On Grace lives, I think the concept of grace lives in that area of our lives that's kind of beyond just what is evidently there. For us physically, or it's beyond winning and losing, right? And so that's what I'm looking at now. And I believe it must exist somewhere in politics, or we wouldn't still be here. I think they're very grim moments, but then there are other moments where there are very interesting kind of collaborations between politicians and people who are doing social services and the public themselves or artists. The last thing I'll say about it is one of my favorite things right now is a beautiful thin volume called 1963, which is Harry Belafonte's remembrances of that year and the struggle to get a civil rights bill and about the March on Washington. And it's a beautiful scene in there where all of these artists are really holding Bobby Kennedy's feet to the fire. It's not about, and then at the end, when Kennedy is killed, Belafonte was in Paris at the time, and he said, I didn't go to the funeral because I was never an insider. Well, that's not my role. I'm supposed to be a catalyst. And so I even think that people who appear to be on the outside of politics, just pushing and shoving from the periphery, have an effect. And I think that's how we begin to see grace, as we each do whatever we do well. It's maybe something unexpected that occurs because we're all working towards, even if we don't know it's a common goal, that place where we are.
So, define it more. Define it more.
Well, there's the Christian.
I just want to be able to respond to the tweet.
So there's the Christian idea, which is best captured in the song "Amazing Grace," which was written by a slave trader, as you know,
yes,
John Newton, and that is pretty much the man in the mirror. That's the Christian idea. A wretch like me, that you look in the mirror. Something happens, there's an intervention by God, and you realize, I can't be that way anymore. But that's very different from the idea of grace, which is a beautiful leaf falling on the ground, or believe it or not, and that snowfall that just happened, or that cold weather, a gracious moment of running in, maybe somebody homeless found some heat, and that would be considered, a moment of grace.
Okay.
But you're looking for a definition for this person who's tweeting you.
No, I'm not actually going to respond to the tweet.
There's not
a lot of grace on Twitter.
That's possibly true.
Yes.
There's not one definition, of course, and the point of the play, and the point of my role as an artist, is to raise the question for the audience and say, do you see it in your life, and where?
Yeah, well, Toni, maybe you can give a greater, not a greater, because that was a lovely definition, but I mean in terms of politics, can you marry these concepts of grace?
I don't think so. Let me start someplace else. I was asked by my staff before we came, we were doing a little run through what I thought of as grace, and I said unexpected blessings, and I guess that's the definition that I would use. And there have surely been a lot of unexpected blessings in my life, and I think unexpected blessings in the political scene sometimes. So I was thinking actually the other day I thought I'd write a note to Representative Ryan from Wisconsin for being willing to try to work with his Senate counterpart on the Senate Budget Committee to put together some agreement that folks in Congress could pass in both the House and the Senate, because it's been a long time since there was any agreement around any budget issues in Congress. And I think I will get to that. But, I thought what he said, what I read in the Tribune, was that he said that he was going to take a lot of heat from members of his party, but sometimes you just have to sort of suck it up and do the right thing. So, and I took that as a moment of grace. And Paul Ryan is somebody who I profoundly disagree with politically, but that he was willing to take that chance and to try to, I won't say redeem, but restore some confidence in the ability of people of the Democratic and Republican parties to work together in Congress, I thought was an important moment.
Well, it is, I should say that it is part of the hope, the mission, the goal of the Institute of Politics to encourage that sense of investment in each other, willingness to listen and work things through as politics at its best. I'm not sure that I thought of it in terms of grace, but that's probably right. The other element, when I looked through the voluminous dictionary definition of grace, there were elements of empathy, elements of understanding others, and I think that is. I remember during the campaign of. It was probably the campaign of 2008 when the word empathy became. When the president said he believed in empathy, and that became sort of a symbolic of a kind of soft-hearted liberalism. But that's, and there's no doubt that he feels solicitude for people in need, but I think that what he was saying was that he always talks about how his mother told him, put yourself in the other person's shoes. Try and understand what it is that they're saying and thinking. And that is, and absorb what they're thinking and try and accept it in the way in which they're thinking so that you can understand it. I think that has been lacking in our politics, that sense of really sitting down and trying to understand what it is that you, even if you're in another political party, or if you come from a different point of view, are saying, and trying to find those points of agreement where you can move forward. That's become unfashionable.
Well, if I were in politics, I would want to put myself in the other person's shoes just so I could learn their argument well enough to defeat it. I mean, there's also that thing about empathy. We think of it as soft. It's not necessarily entirely soft. It's a kind of imagination that allows you to really see behind that other person. So I think of empathy as it can be strategic. It's not necessarily, let's not maybe mince words, but it's not even necessarily the same as compassion. Mm-hmm. But that ability to feel as someone else can be extraordinarily instructive. I mean, when you get ready for debates, you have people who tell you what the other person's going to say, right?
Yes.
You anticipate it.
Yes, yes. You've interviewed in the course of this project a number of people, including people in public life, Sandra Day O'Connor, John Lewis. What did you learn from those interviews? What did they tell you about grace?
Well, I don't want to give away the show. You have to come to the show.
Which is...
all right, I love it. Michael Tickness is clapping away right there.
There's a performance of the show. What is it, the 21st?
The 21st
at the Harris Theater.
So
Joan Harris is sitting right here.
Joan Harris is right here.
This opportunity to thank Joan for bringing Anna to Chicago. And all the other stuff you do. But everybody will keep it to themselves.
Well, let me just say that you know that John Lewis is a great civil rights leader, and so you can imagine that he would have something to offer the conversation. And then with Sandra Day O'Connor, I think you just have to wait. We're studying her very hard right now, actually, the people who are working with me, Michael, my movement coach, and Hillary. young student here, very smart, Hillary. So I can't, I don't, come see it. You'll be delighted.
How could we not now? But let's talk about John Lewis for a second. Here's a guy who was beaten almost, to within an inch of his life in Selma. And I think anyone who works with him or comes into contact with him is struck by his kindness, his decency. How did he make that transition from?
Well, my sense is that people who were in his era on the freedom rides with him, and here we are in the wake of the death of Nelson Mandela, we do have many historical opportunities to look at people who, again, if you think of empathy not as just some soft thing, or you think about nonviolence, the practice of nonviolence is not just some soft thing, that there are other ways to obviously even win a battle than just force. So I think of nonviolent resistance, what he must have learned in that, or if you read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, the argument that King is making is really quite a moral argument. And I would say that one of the things we need in our country right now, from my point of view, just as a soft artist, is in fact a moral imagination. That can help us in a time like now, that's a bitter time, and it's all about winning and losing. So I think that he had he had many great teachers around him during that movement, and I mean we're blessed that we could learn from his leadership.
So do you get a sense of what that equanimity, how that equanimity serves him as a member of this Congress?
Oh, I don't know. What do you think about that? You think it does him any good?
I don't know. I'm a local politician, so I don't. I can't pretend to know what people are thinking in Congress. As you were talking about Martin Luther King. So full disclosure, I'm a history teacher by profession, and I usually say I'm a teacher with a temp job. So I want to recommend a book. Is that okay? I'm a big fan of Taylor Branch, and Taylor Branch has written a 3-volume autobiography of the civil rights movement that begins with Parting the Waters, which is one of my favorite books. And so I encourage those of you who love history as I do, and are particularly interested in the civil rights movement, and not just Martin Luther King, but John Lewis and all the other folks who made it possible, to read Taylor Branch's trilogy, starting with Parting the Waters.
And he made a brief version of it for high school students.
He did.
Abbreviated version.
Yeah.
You meant, since we're on the subject, and most of these people know Father Flager, and interesting story, because he grew up in Marquette Park and in a segregated neighborhood, and he cites King's visit to Marquette Park, his march on Marquette Park in 1966, as the sort of pivotal moment in his life, because he rode his bike down to Marquette Park and saw Dr. King marching, and people throwing bottles and bricks and shouting invective at him. And Father Flager said, I saw people who I worshiped with on Sundays shouting these awful things. And he said, and here was this man just looking left and looking right and saying, I love you, I love you. And he said, I thought, who is this man that he could be so forgiving and so resistant to this hatred and not consumed by it. That transformed, I think, a lot of lives watching Dr. King. There also were the examples of the people who, you mentioned others, these young kids who came from the north, who went down, who didn't live with the burdens of segregation, and some of whom lost their lives. I mean, I would think they would be the definition of grace. But I do want to ask you, Toni, I mean, I make jokes about it. It's easy to make jokes about Chicago politics. People have been doing it for a long time. But in the course of your work, and you know, you're a history teacher, you're a public official, but you've also had to operate in a very, very tough political environment. Do you see examples of grace among, you know, from our political system on a day-to-day basis? I mean, can you point to things and say, this is politics at its best, this is grace? Take your time.
This is politics at its best. That isn't often a thought that's occurred to me, but you know, so I'm an independent progressive Democrat, and I have struggled to survive and succeed in a sort of regular organization town. And that has been a challenge, and I have tried to sort of hold to my principles while trying to navigate difficult waters, let's put it that way. And you know, I think I've been, as I said, blessed with a lot of help and support in that effort, and come across some really good people in unexpected places. So, you know, I think I have two sort of contradictory thoughts about politics in Chicago. One is, you know, when I was alderman, people would come to me sometimes and be very critical of other members of the city council. And I would point out to them that I didn't live in other wards and I didn't elect those people, and if they wanted better representation, they needed to work for it themselves. And that to the extent that they were unhappy with the political leadership in their community, it was their obligation to try to do something about it. You know, what I usually say is, you know, in a democracy, you may not get the government that you deserve, but you'll surely get the government that you put up with. And in Chicago and Illinois, unfortunately, we've been willing to we have a very low bar for people in public life. So I'll tell us.
Partly because some of them are behind bars.
Well, you know, what I said about the city, what I always said about the city council is, you know, it was made up of 50 people, and you could randomly pick 50 people off the street to be members of the city council, and some of them would be very good and work very hard, and some would sort of just slide by, and a few would be very problematic, and the same thing is true of the city council. So I don't think that members of the city council, anyway, where I served for 19 years, are that much different in the aggregate than the general population. The difference is, of course, that the newspapers aren't microscopically looking at your life and what you do in your profession in the same way that they do for politicians. But as I said, in Illinois, we've set the bar pretty low for what our expectations of our elected officials are. I'll tell a quick story on myself. I ran for office first in 1983 and lost. I ran in 1987 and lost, and I ran in 1991 and won by 109 votes. But in my first campaign in 1983, so I'm here in Chicago, in my home state of Minnesota, they prosecuted a woman. The state elections board took action against a woman who served punch and cookies at one of her events on the grounds that she was attempting to unduly influence the voters. And I usually say that I'm honest by Illinois standards, but I'm not sure how well I do in Minnesota. So.
Can I ask, just mention that, okay, so if I were looking at what you just said, President, I would be interested in where you talked about navigating difficult waters. And I would ask you to talk more about that, because I think that grace also lives in that place where something's very hard to do. And you don't just figure it out, but you come into your stride of it. And so that's where grace and beauty sort of come in together. A graceful dancer is somebody who has figured out what to do with gravity. It's not easy. And so I would say that there is in politics something that those of us who aren't in politics probably can't fully appreciate, which is when the game is played well.
Yes.
Whether it's on our side or not.
Yes. Well, Toni should answer this question because she's the practitioner. I'm an academic. But you know, when you say it's not all about winning and losing, that to me is the first and most important point, because if you're going to be in public life, if you're going to be in politics, it ought to be about more than winning and losing, and it's not for a lot of people in politics. But for those who are in it for something more than that, there is this, it is a difficult terrain to navigate to get to accomplishing things, because there are all kinds of political barriers. But you're right. I think that there are graceful people in politics who without compromising their principles, but recognizing that compromise is necessary, move things forward. I guess this goes to your point about Ryan and Patty Murray doing what they did. But sometimes it involves, and this is when, this is that moment that you're talking about, it involves doing things that have some degree of risk to it, that may in fact require you to do something that could cost you an election. And you know, for me, as someone who's been working in politics for a long time and writing about it before that, those are exhilarating moments when people are willing to do the hard thing that puts themselves and their career at risk, because they recognize that their career is only worth something if they accomplish something large for something larger than themselves, someone larger than themselves. So anyway.
You know, I guess I should tell a couple anecdotes. When I first got elected in 1991, I spent the first few months explaining to people that they didn't have to slide an envelope of cash across the table for me to try to help them.
And let's be clear, she didn't take credit cards either.
No, I didn't take credit cards either. And it was astonishing to me how often that happened. And what you do is just say no. You don't have to pay me for me to do my job. And so after the first 6 months or so, the word got around and that stopped happening. So that was good. But it was clear to me that was kind of the pattern and practice. And so it took some time for me to re-educate people about what to expect. There were times when I felt that I had to take positions which I wasn't sure were going to be popular. Not as often as you might think, though, because I was blessed to represent a ward which included some of the most progressive communities in the city, and that was a privilege, both personally and politically. So I didn't often find myself in conflict with my constituents. When I did, I tried very hard to try to explain my position to people, because I've always believed that it's important not just to do the right thing, but to explain why you're doing it, and to try to engage people and bring them along. And I suppose I got to that point because I'm a teacher by profession and a high school teacher to boot. There is no more difficult audience than a room full of teenagers. And it's important for you not just to mutter dictates, but to try to explain things to people, engage them, and engage them at the level where they are. So I spent a lot of time when I was in office, especially in the first few years, talking to my constituents all across the ward, particularly in Hyde Park and Kenwood, where people basically elected me. I didn't win a precinct outside of Hyde Park or Kenwood. That it was very important for me to spend my time basically working elsewhere, working in North Kenwood and Douglas and Grand Boulevard, the communities to the north which desperately needed time and attention. And Hyde Park and South Kenwood were racially integrated, vibrant, economically integrated communities, and those communities were struggling. So I think I spent the first decade or more in office writing consistently for the Hyde Park Herald and talking to people all across the ward, but particularly in Hyde Park and South Kenwood, about how basically I got elected by the people who would elect me, but I had to serve the people who needed service. So if I had been elected to a different kind of ward, I think I would have had a much harder time being a proponent of affordable housing and mixed income communities and an advocate for justice in our criminal justice system than I would have if I maybe had a different kind of constituency. So the challenges that I faced, I think, were around within my community, struggling to engage people and explain why I was pursuing the course I was pursuing. But in the political arena, the challenge was to hold on to those independent, progressive ideals in an environment that wasn't necessarily conducive to those ideals. So that's it's been an interesting journey.
And history is replete with examples of people who make hard decisions. You know, there's been a lot of reflection because of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and the fight for civil rights and so on, about how the Civil Rights Bill was passed. And Everett Dirksen, who was a conservative Republican senator from this state, helped pass the Civil Rights Bill. And it wasn't enormously popular for him to do it. It was difficult to do. Those kinds of decisions are, you know, impressive to me. They're someone is writing a biography of George H.W. Bush told me that he wrote in his diary when he passed the when he decided to sign the tax increase in 1990 that was so politically vexing to other Republicans that he might have just made himself a one-term president, but he thought it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of moments of grace that one looks for
Or courage.
in politics.
Courage.
Yeah.
Courage.
Yeah, but I think they're related because it involves being willing to say there are things larger than yourself.
Well, one of the people who, I mean, we have like so much material from this individual that I think it's fine to say something that she said. The younger people in particular will know about Professor Judith Butler. She's quite popular with them. And one of the remarks she made about grace is that it names that thing which you do not possess, that you don't own. You don't own it. So maybe that's a flaw in our political system, that particularly parties want to own a certain constituency or own an idea, but grace isn't owned, you know. So I think the thing that would cause someone to do something difficult is kind of an understanding that they don't own it. And I think it does call for from what I'm understanding so far, to use a word that's overused, I think it does call for a little rest from narcissism.
Which is a hard thing for politicians to do. I mean, honestly. I mean, when you do not, I mean, I say it only half jokingly because there is a certain psychological makeup to a lot of people who go into politics, and they go into it because they crave the affirmation, or the approbation that comes with it, and that becomes primary to them. And sometimes doing, you know, doing the right thing in politics requires giving some of that up, risking that, and that's not a natural act for a lot of people in politics. I want to talk, you know, and it's interesting to come back to this because I think in certain ways our struggles with race create these kinds of very difficult choices because of the kind of visceral nature of that issue in our society. But those of you who are here who remember the mayoral race in 1983 when you were running for alderman, practicing to run for alderman that time in 87 so you could win in 91.
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
I choose to be a positive about these things. But Harold Washington was running for mayor that year. And I was not a consultant at that time. I ended up working for him later, but I was the City Hall bureau chief for the Tribune. And I covered this mayoral race. And you'll remember this, Toni, the blue buttons with the sunburst on them. And all of a sudden, it seemed like every African-American person in the city was wearing that button. And, you know, some white folks as well. But for those voters, you know, there was this sense among some in the white community, and I think some who were covering the race, that there was something ominous about this, this force that was. But to me, there was something really inspiring about it, because it was a whole bunch of people who had felt left out of the political system and left out of the civic life of our city, who felt all of a sudden like they were part of it, that they were an equal shareholder in the business of the city and the politics of the city. And I wrote a whole column about those blue buttons and what they meant. And I ended up working for Harold in '87 when he ran for mayor. And I was impressed by the fact that he won as a factional kind of candidate, but he governed, and there were obviously tussles in the city council and so on. But he was very conscious of the fact that he was mayor of the whole city, spent most of his time not in the black community, but in other parts of the city, really stressed that. And that was, you know, there was a quality there. I don't know if it comes into the grace quality, but that was important for someone who wanted to lead the entire city. But those blue buttons was what I wanted to mention. And I'm not sure if it was germane or not, but I really liked the story.
Yeah, I think the blue buttons were not simply racial solidarity, although that surely was an important element, but also a reflection of people's hope.
Yes,
and
yes.
Speaking of hope and change,
Yes.
I think that was surely true in that campaign, and it was strengthened, I think, by the way in which Bernie Epton ran, at least in the general election.
He was the Republican candidate who ran against Harold Washington, who was actually a Republican from this area, lived in Hyde Park, a liberal Republican, when there still was such a thing. You can see them, they're stuffed in the Field Museum. And he was a leader on civil rights issues in the legislature. I mean, he was a solid voter on civil rights issues, but became the instrument of anti-Washington forces and ran under the slogan that they chose for him, which was Epton now before it's too late.
Right. That's what I was going to say. He became
Not a graceful moment.
A poster child for the most reactionary parts of the white community in the city. And you know, I always thought that was a terrible way for him to kind of end his political career, given what he had stood for previously. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure he fully even understood what was, he made kind of a Faustian bargain. He wasn't that sophisticated a politician. And, you know, when Harold won the primary, you know, the national Republicans came in, the state Republicans came in, they took over his campaign, and he became sort of an instrument of their aspirations. And, you know, it was an interesting and sad story, and he almost won. He only lost by 4 points.
Well, the other thing is, just to speak to the point about Harold thinking of himself as a mayor for all of the people in Chicago, I heard some grumbling in the African American community about that fact, to the effect that he wasn't behaving like a black mayor, that the spoils of victory were being spread out more broadly, particularly into the Latino community and the progressive white community, and that as an African American mayor, he should have held everything a little more close and distributed the goodies a little differently. So I think that's...
And I must tell you that he wasn't rewarded for that, particularly. In the second race against, when he ran for re-election against Jane Byrne, he had gotten 8% of the white vote in 1983, and he got 21% in 1987. Thank you. And I remember sitting with him after the election, and he said, everybody was very happy because he won by 80,000 votes, big win, And he said, "What percentage of the white vote did I get?" And someone said 21%, but that's really good because you only got 8% last time. And he kind of smiled and he said, I think I've been a mayor good mayor for all the city. I've probably spent 70% of my time in those white neighborhoods. And he said, and we got 21% of the vote, and we're happy about it. And he just kind of shook his head and smiled again and said, "Ain't it a bitch to be a black man in the land of the free and the home of the brave?" But he never wavered from his commitment to be that mayor. I think that we probably are at a point where we want to take some questions from the audience. So if you have questions, and if we have microphones, that would be a wonderful marriage of events. Here, come. Yes.
How you doing? My name is Malcolm Linden. Great to be here. A lot of information. My question was does grace look like to you? The University of Chicago, living and existing in this neighborhood, but not having a trauma center for its for the people in this neighborhood. So I just wanted to know, does that look graceful to you, and what kind of politics does that look like?
Feels like a point of view. But Toni, you're the office holder. Yeah.
I don't think it's a question. I think it's a statement. Unfortunately, the University of Chicago isn't the only healthcare institution that's closed its trauma center. They're extraordinarily expensive to operate, and we have one at Stroger Hospital, which is a public hospital, of course. And I think the other closest one is at 95th Street in Western, at Christ or something. So we desperately need one on the Mid-South Side, and I think that's something we need to work on to try to support with frankly public resources and not just university resources. Although I will say that I'm hopeful the university will do better in working with our public health system to provide care for the uninsured. We provide $500 million, $500 million a year in charity care in our health and hospital system, and institutions like the University of Chicago and Rush and Northwestern and Loyola provide less than 5%. So there's some work to be done there.
Anna, my question is related to your marvelous book, Talk to Me, in which you write at some length about the concept of authentic speech. And when you talk about that, you generally talk about, when a politician, you're in the press briefing room, a politician will say something that's kind of off the script, the kind of thing that David used to pull his hair out about, and often those were seen as negative things. When a politician would go off and they would get in, you'd really get a sense of what they're saying. Did you find things in that context where someone went off the talking points and hit a grace note and went the other way in a more positive way?
Well, I love it when people go off their talking points, because that's what's the most interesting to me and why I do what I do. What I found in Washington was very disheartening in terms of, and this was in '96, between, I traveled with Clinton and Dole on their campaigns, and then hung around Washington through, I was going to leave, and then Monica Lewinsky, that happened. And so I was there for about 5 years, and this was best expressed by Roger Kennedy, a scholar of Jefferson, who said that Jefferson could never be found in verbal undress. And so I thought that for me as a student of language, Washington is sort of the haute couture of language. I mean, I remember when President Obama was standing at a press conference, and I thought to myself, wow, he looks so graceful. He's like kind of just very nicely moving his foot around. And I thought, he's going to get in trouble before this press conference is over. And you know which press conference it was? It was the one about the cops who came and, roughed up Professor Gates.
Yeah.
And it happened. I was like, wow, you really cannot afford in Washington to be relaxed. And I think it's for what both of you do. And Toni, when you were talking about explaining, there is this real need, obviously, for a narrative that is compelling, a big story that a politician is trying to tell, and the more powerful they are, the more original and compelling and inviting that story has to be. And I don't know how you manage to find graceful moments in that, really, because those of us who study compelling stories, charismatic moments, and gestures have a lot more leeway. We have a lot more leeway. We can't really get caught out the way that, a president or any politician is really strutting on a stage of history. And the smallest gesture, the smallest word is just blown up for the world to see. And so I think it's interesting to me how in your businesses you manage to breathe real life and love into those narratives, because I think of those narratives as coming alive, in particular when somebody veers off, makes a different sound. We're studying right now in like a long interview that I did of Sandra Day O'Connor, a moment when her voice goes up in a way we didn't hear, and that's what keeps us excited, me and my team. But I don't think that's really allowed very much in this world of politics, where you have to watch your words as well as everything else.
Her voice going up probably caught the attention of a lot of lawyers over the years, too. But listen, I think that the hardest thing, I think one of the most frustrating things for Obama, in my experience, has been his frustration with the sort of the sort of small politics that says, that takes a word, a comment, and turns it into a media event instead of having a larger conversation and a more meaningful conversation. So,
but at a certain point, you get better at it, right?
Yeah, he has, although, he's resistant to it, to be honest with you, and I admire him for being resistant to it. But in terms of these big stories that you're talking about, my experience has always been, it's okay to have a big story as long as the big story is authentic and the big story is predicated on who you actually are and not who you think you need to be in order to succeed. With him, that's always been the case. We've never tried to, we've tried to build on who he was, and he would wouldn't have it any other way. But there are always those moments, as the questioner pointed out, that is, in fact, how I lost most of my hair. Chris?
First and foremost, thank you all for coming here today. I truly appreciate you taking the time to speak to the UChicago community. I wanted to ask you a question, Toni Preckwinkle, around the idea of this school-to-prison pipeline. President Obama recently issued a statement regarding with the aim to address the disproportionate minority contact of youth in the school system who get pushed into the prison system, coming from school, going straight to prison. In your opinion, what do you think, or if given more power, say mayor's office or any other political office that would give you all the resources and capital you need to address the issue, what steps you think the city should take in order to address this school-to-prison pipeline in the city?
Okay, so the question is about the school-to-prison pipeline. Let me talk a little bit about where we are now. So my major responsibilities are public health and public safety. Public safety is about 41% of our budget. We spend, speaking of $500 million, we spend $500 million every year on our jail alone. Many of you think that the jail is where people serve sentences, but in fact only 10% of the people in our jail are serving a sentence. 90% are awaiting trial, 90%. Of those who are awaiting trial, 70% are awaiting trial for nonviolent offenses. Low-level drug offenses, shoplifting, the things, prostitution, the things people do to get money for their drugs, driving under the influence, not paying your child support. 70% of the people who are awaiting trial are awaiting trial for nonviolent offenses. Only 30% are awaiting trial for crimes against human beings, murder, rape, robbery, the things that scare us. Of the people in our jail, 86% are black and brown. What I usually say is, the jail is at the intersection of racism and poverty in this country. Most of the people in our jail are there because they can't pay their bond. And African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately represented. I usually tell the joke that if you went to our jail, you would think there were no white people who lived in Cook County. So one of the things that I've committed myself to do is to try to reduce our jail population, to try to provide alternatives to detention for people who are awaiting trial, and to divert people out of the criminal justice system in the first place. So we're looking at diversion, for example, for people who are accused of prostitution, to keep them out of the criminal justice system entirely, rather than putting them into our jail. And by the way, it's it's the prostitutes that get arrested. Surprise, not the Johns, but anyway. So, I believe that not every person and not every community gets treated the same by the police, particularly the police in Chicago. Chicago is half the population of Cook County, but 80% of the people in our jail are from Chicago. And that's a reflection of how communities get policed, talking about disparities in policing strategies. If you're African American Latino, you're much more likely to stop. If you're a young man, more likely to be stopped by the police if you're standing on the corner with your friends. If you're stopped by the police, you're more likely to be, put up against the car and frisked rather than just told to go home. If you're caught with a small amount of marijuana, you're more likely to be taken to the police station and put in the criminal justice system than what they call a station adjustment, which means that your parents are called and they send you home with your parents. And once you get into the criminal justice system, you're much more likely to get a sentence than to get out on probation or have some more favorable disposition of your case. So in every point you can think of, from who gets stopped to who gets sent home with station adjustments, and particularly for young people, to what happens to you when you come in the criminal justice system, black and brown young men are treated differently. And that's a reflection, as I said, of the racism in our society, unacknowledged and profound. And, you know, I usually talk about this in two ways. One, I make a fiscal argument that this is incredibly wasteful. It costs us $143 a day to keep somebody in jail, $52,000 roughly a year. Yeah, we could send people to Harvard for what it costs us to keep them in jail for a year. And I also make the social justice argument, you know, based on racial injustice. And both of those are true, and I talk about them in sort of varying combinations depending on what the audience is. But it's important for us to remember that we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the people in the entire world who are in jail or prison. And it's not because we detain and incarcerate white people at astonishing rates. It's because we detain and incarcerate black and brown young people at incredible rates, for which, you know, we're all going to have to be held account someday. It's, you know, this is, when I give that statistic, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the people in jail or prison in the entire world. You know, I think I usually wait a beat, you know, and say, you know, you would think that maybe this is China or, you know, some awful authoritarian country in Eastern Europe or in Latin America or someplace, but, you know, ladies and gentlemen, it's us. And it's damning. So where I am, my responsibilities are public health and public safety. My goal is to try to get nonviolent offenders out of the jail, to put money into, and we're starting to do that, into anti-violence and anti-recidivism programs to try to keep people out of jail in the first place, and to try to put pressure on the court system to expedite cases so that people don't stay in jail for a long time if they're going to be in jail, and to try to talk to all of the actors in the criminal justice system about the unfair and inequitable ways in which our criminal justice system impacts communities of color. So that's what I'm doing, where I am. But I think that we need to look at the school part of it. If you're not in school, you're more likely to be out on the street and therefore have interactions with the police, especially if you're black or brown. So if you can keep kids in school, if you keep them active and engaged, and rather than out on the street, rather than dropping out, plenty of after-school activities, investing in after-school activities for kids, investing in summer jobs for young people. The county and the city have worked together on One Summer Chicago to provide jobs and mentoring and support for some of our most at-risk kids. We need to continue those kind of investments. But the part that's my responsibility that's on my plate is the criminal justice system. So that's where I've tried to come at the issue. Okay?
But the second piece is very, very accepting everything you say. The second piece is just so important because we have to have a higher aspiration for our kids than to keep them from being in jail. And I know you're not saying otherwise. I know you were responding from your perspective as someone who's in charge of that aspect of the system. But you know, these kids are born with the same potential as anybody else. And the question is, what more are we going to do so that we're not only diverting them from jail, but we're facilitating you know, a productive, rewarding, and meaningful life.
And what about the things that happen that are absolutely graceless in terms of the ways in which kids are shoved out of school? You know, I don't know if they have it here, but in California, something called willful defiance. If you look at a teacher the wrong way, you can be shoved out of school. So also sort of actions that might be considered mischief elsewhere in other environments, in schools, have very strong ramifications for black and brown kids. I mean, I think the education part of it has to do with something that is related to this idea that I was talking about before about a moral imagination in this country. Is why do we feel, how have we gotten, I'm a product of the civil rights movement. I'm a product of moving from segregated school into an integrated school, which in my case was a very good thing for me and for the development of a worldview and so forth. But I don't know how we get our countrymen to be concerned about more than the person who lives in their house.
Yes.
And in that way, I think we're at a real loss, because I know that Joan, for example, is very always, you talk about early childhood education, and you know, when I hear people talk about the way out now, they talk about early childhood education. And on the plane, when I finally was able to get a plane to come here last week, during your beautiful cold weather spell, like Thornton Wilder's skin of our teeth, I guess. There was this little baby who was 2 months old. I was surprised she could even allowed to fly. And she didn't cry the entire trip from New York, which was amazing. And her mother, I mean, she was about that big. Her mother was holding her in her hand as we were waiting for some gate agent to finally let us off the plane. And the baby, the mother was saying, hi, this is 2 months old. Now, I know there's all this work being done to try to get kids talking, you know, when they're 3 or 4, but this baby was increased vocabulary. This baby was saying hi back to her mother. And I don't need to tell you that. I mean, so are there interventions that we can start to try to encourage that are about giving everybody back to these ideas that we had little smatterings of for little openings of time that had to do with giving everybody an opportunity not just to excel for their own sake. I'm thinking about the president's remarks right after the Trayvon, what we would call the Trayvon verdict. You know, he said he and the First Lady were very concerned about how to cause African American men to be productive, more productive members of our society. Of course, I would like to add young African American women, or everybody deserves a chance, and we've just really lost our way. And we know that it's an economic problem, it's a moral problem, and it is a security problem at this point. But I don't see, and my next project is going to be on education, I don't see a will to take care of more than the people around us. I'm a professor at NYU. I've been teaching for 40 years, and my students have gotten wealthier and more educated, to the point that I wonder, why do they need me, right? Because somebody has been investing in the people that I teach from the time they were 2 years old. And I know that at least at NYU, pretty soon we'll be in a position where the only people who will be able to come are either poor people or rich people. And so even the middle class is getting left out of this whole thing. So how have we gotten to this very graceless point?
Well, I think this is an essential point. I mean, it goes to one of the fundamental definitions of grace, and it goes to that discussion we were having about before, which is, do we recognize ourselves in others? Do we recognize our stake in others? And it's not just that we don't want to create a felon who might harm us. It's that we all have an investment in each other. And if, you know, the president says it, and I believe it, that, you know, every child is our child in a way. And we, you know, we are better when every child has an opportunity to fulfill
But we
themselves.
completely lack that imagination is what I think right now. And I think that's very, very sad, because I just think of the big-heartedness that I was able to be a part of that moved me from, you know, Baltimore, Maryland, you know, James Mosher School, elementary school, the big-heartedness that happened. I mean, not just that I was able to go to a better school, but I was able to have friends who weren't just like me. Was a great stimulation to my imagination.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's happened to our sort of public life is that, and it's, you know, it's been the last 30, 40 years, I mean, it's not recent, is, you know, so much emphasis on personal security, you know, fear of crime, you know, starting with what Nixon's crime in the street stuff, that both magnifies the extent of crime in this country and demonizes people of color. There's so much of that that is just kind of unconscious in our public life and in our politics, to the point, as I said, where we're prepared to spend $52,000 a year to keep somebody in jail, and we begrudge our public schools money. You know, profoundly penny wise and pound foolish. You know, we're much better off investing in early childhood education and public education, good public schools for our kids, than investing in our criminal justice system. But somehow we've gotten to the point in this country where it's not controversial to talk about spending a lot of money, you know, jailing people, and it is controversial to talk about dramatically increasing the resources for our public schools.
But it's also the case that Anna sits here, as she said, because someone gave her that opportunity. I'm the son of an immigrant who came here, and someone gave him an opportunity. And I'd like to think that, you know, in some way, we've been able to benefit others because of the opportunities that we got. And, you know, so it's not just an investment, not just a smarter investment to give kids an education instead of sending them to prison. Some of those kids are going to be sitting on this stage, or could be, and some of them, many of them will make huge contributions in ways that we don't even know. That's what the lost potential is something that we should all be concerned about.
Right. It isn't just about the money. I mean, what we've made, and in my view, you know, sort of terrible public choices in the way in which we've used our public resources. But as you say, it's profoundly about the opportunities that are available to particularly our young people in this country. And that's the place we are now is kind of discouraging for me in terms of the opportunities that are available to young people. And you know, just thinking about school, coming back to college, you know, kids coming out of school, for example, now with so much in student loans, and everybody thinks that's okay, because after all, they're going to be the beneficiaries of their education. But in fact, we're all the beneficiaries of, you know, a well-educated population, and the idea that that burden should solely be borne by the kids and their families, I think, is just wrong-headed. You know, we need to make college, especially first-rate institutions, more accessible to everybody, and the idea that first-rate education is increasingly only available to the very rich and to the very poor is discouraging.
Well, I have some bad news too, which is, you know, I have a very complicated relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Sometimes I think
Many others did as well, I think.
Yeah, that's
Sometimes I think he's really the coolest cat, and then you come across something. It's in the notes on the state of Virginia. You can go home and Google it. If you Google the notes on the state of Virginia, and you search for the word rubbish, you will find that Thomas Jefferson made a proposal for he had a plan for public education. And in it, he promised that if you went with this plan, you would be able to discover the excellent ones and throw away the rubbish. And so I think that we are at this position where we're just treating a lot of people like they're rubbish if they can't, you know, make whatever the game is considered to be. And I think what we've lost sight of is it might be great to get to come to the University of Chicago, it might be great to get to go to Harvard or NYU or Stanford or whatever, but even the fact that we've prioritized all these elite institutions is that, you know, let's just make all the schools good so that people get turned on to the joy of learning. That it's not just this race that we're doing to be special, but that we really ask and invite kids and even people to come back to school to say, hey, this is something that you can get switched on. You have this thing here that can get switched on in so many ways. And even, I'm not so sure the empathic imagination gets developed inside of our prisons either. I doubt it. I mean, I was very discouraged to visit a prison this summer and to talk to jailers in California who absolutely go along with the desire of the prisoner to be segregated by race. That's the way they want it, that's the way it is. And so I think that that very thing is like the lowest of what we can be in every way. And so even somebody who wants to get out of that situation has to work very hard to come back to that part of themselves, which is empathic.
We are we're running out of time here, so I don't want people leaving here
Down.
Yeah. Well, because here's the thing. You're sitting here and you're devoting your life to this project and a future project on education and God willing, lots of other projects that you hope will have an impact. You're devoting your life to public service in the hope that you can improve these things. If you guys didn't believe that we can make a difference, then you wouldn't be here. And I think we ought to leave on the presumption that we can.
I'm going to let Toni have the last word, but I will say that I'm always in this argument with my director, Leonard Folia, because he's like you. He thinks my plays have to end with an the good news. I personally, I'm really attracted to catastrophe. All my
You should
plays,
go back to Washington.
all my plays, except for On Grace, are about catastrophe. I think catastrophe is very mobilizing. I think it gives us a sense of what we can do. So I will just say that, whatever I've said here about Thomas Jefferson and rubbish and everything else, I hope it inspires people to believe they can make a difference.
No, I'm not suggesting catastrophe can't be mobilized. I just want to make sure we leave with a resolve to be mobilized.
You get to do that.
I began my professional career as a high school teacher. I loved being a teacher and was energized by being around young people so much. And I have great hopes for my country, although I despair quite often about our present circumstances because I have confidence in the generation that's coming up to work hard to struggle with the challenges we face today. And frankly, in my own life, I've had the opportunity now to be president of the board for the last 3 years, and I believed at the time that I was elected, and still believe that of the people who were running anyway, I was the best person for the job. And so I've had an opportunity to try to make an impact on things that I really think are important: the public health and public safety issues. So I take that as a moment of grace. Thank you.
I want to thank Anna for being here with us now and being with us during this period. We were all sufficiently curious as to see you on the 21st at the Harris Center, to see what you're hiding from us tonight. And Toni, it's great to be with you as well. And I will tell you as a closing note, just in my own role here at the Institute of Politics, that there isn't a day that I leave here and go home that I don't feel better about the future because of my interaction with the young people I've met here. I think this is, they've heard me say it a million times, but the most public-spirited group of young people, not just here, but around the country, that I've seen since the 1960s. And I think that they do have moral imagination. And it's an honor to be with them on a day-to-day basis. So we appreciate you being with them tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.